Good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be among you today, worshiping with you and reminding each other of how great our God is. And I hope in the next several minutes I can encourage you to do that, and you can, as we read, you can be encouraged and you can be lifted up by the things that we study together. We've been engaged in a study on authority for a number of weeks now. I hope you're not bored with it. I'm trying to vary the lessons and give some different types of lessons on the topic of authority, and it's one of the most important topics of Scripture. And to help us discern God's will and to help us establish authority, we're looking at the best example there is. We're looking to Jesus Christ and how Jesus looked to the Scriptures for His authority. Last week we saw how Jesus in Matthew chapter 15 interpreted the commands of God. Now today what we want to do is look in Matthew chapter 12, just a few pages over. Here's another encounter between Jesus and the Pharisees, and it's about a controversy surrounding the Sabbath. We're going to look at the first 8 verses of Matthew chapter 12. Now, I hope you were here last week. If you weren't, that's all right. If you were, please remember we talked about the Jewish orthodoxy, how they created what was called the Mishnah. And the Mishnah was the accepted interpretations of the law. This is what the law of Moses meant. This is what we say it means anyway. And that was the accepted interpretation, and people were held to that in the first century. And of course, you know, Matthew just records all these accounts. They're great. You know, usually it's a group trying to come to Jesus and trying to trick him, and then Jesus says something awesome, and then they feel like they don't know anything, and Jesus wins at the end. But He's teaching us something about how He handles the Scriptures. And there's no God-breathed topic that is more egregiously butchered by the traditions of the Jews than the Sabbath. And mind you, it was Jesus' refusal to obey their man-made rules about the Sabbath that set in motion the chain of events that crucified Him. If you look in verse 14, right here in this context, this was the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. In verse 14, the Pharisees went out and conspired against Him as to how they might destroy Him. And so what we're talking about today is really important. It was important enough to tick these Jews off enough that they were willing to commit murder against a fellow Jew. So let's go through this text together. Where did I put that? Right here. The first verse, first of all, the alleged violation. At that time, Matthew records in verse 1, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and His disciples became hungry and began to pick the heads of grain and eat. You get the picture, right? The disciples are hungry. They're traveling along. Here's a field of grain, and so they reach out with their hands. They pluck or they pick the heads off the grain. They take the shells of the grain, rub them in their hands together to break the kind of shell and the husk. They pop them in their mouth. It's a good first century snack on the go kind of thing. Seems very harmless. Seems very, very harmless, verse 1. But you see the Pharisees bring a charge. They see this happening. And here's what they say. But when the Pharisees saw this, verse 2, they said to Him, again, they're directing their focus to Jesus, holding Jesus responsible for His disciples' actions. They said to Him, "Look, your disciples do what is not lawful to do on a Sabbath." So, the basis for their allegation here was not God's law, not what God has said, but the basis for their allegation was their own traditions and their own interpretations of the law. They say, Jesus, what you guys are doing is unlawful. That's another way of saying what you guys are doing is unauthorized. Not unauthorized according to God, but really according to them. And so, what in the world is the issue? Well, the issue wasn't that they were eating the grain. No, Mosaic law stated that it was fine. It was totally fine for you to eat your neighbor's grain. As long as Deuteronomy 23 and 25, if you want to go back there, you can read it. As long as you're not taking a sickle and you're cutting down a big portion of it, you are allowed to take it with your hands and you are allowed to eat. God's law permitted that. That's not the issue. But the Pharisees argued, their sticking point with his disciples was not exactly what they were doing, but when they were doing it. It was on the Sabbath. And they were arguing that what they were doing constituted work. And therefore, because they were working, they were breaking the Sabbath. Back in the Ten Commandments, God gives the commandment to do no work on the day that He rested from creation. Remember the Sabbath day? To keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male or your female servant, or your cattle or your sojourner who stays with you. And he gives the basis for this. We'll talk about it later. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So, all the Jews understood, and you understand as you read this text, that you shouldn't work on the Sabbath. Labor was forbidden, but the Jews were confused. What exactly constituted working? What exactly does that word labor mean? How far should we take it? So this word labor and this command, it wasn't spelled out with specificity to the Jews' satisfaction. For example, how long could you walk on the Sabbath day for it to be constituted as working? How do you go about answering that question? This was a question in the days that Jesus walked the earth. In fact, when we read the book of Acts, Luke has this little tidbit of information in chapter 1. Here are the disciples, and they're traveling between Jerusalem and Mount Olivet. And Luke just adds this in there. He just says that the length of their journey was a Sabbath day's journey away. What in the world is that? Well, the Jews devised this system of determining what was work and what wasn't work, and what was breaking the Sabbath and what wasn't breaking the Sabbath. And the rabbis, I don't know how they came up with this number, but they arbitrarily set this limit. You could walk 2,000 cubits, but if you walk 2,001 cubits, well then you broke the Sabbath. That's about 3/5 of a mile. That's what they came up with. Don't ask me how exactly they came to that conclusion, but you remember the Mishnah. The Mishnah, actually I've been doing some reading. You can look at it online. It's really interesting. The Mishnah lists 39 varieties of prohibited Sabbath work. And it's called the Melecha. And if you want to read all of those, I won't give you time, but these are the 39 prohibited things that you couldn't do on the Sabbath. And if you did these things, then this was Exodus 20, this was work. And so you were breaking the Sabbath. But let's look at bread up there at the top. Planting, plowing, reaping, gathering, threshing, extraction, winnowing, sorting, purification, grinding, sifting, kneading, amalgamation, cooking, baking. Do you see plucking? Do you see picking? I don't see that. It's not there. But, interestingly, I kid you not, Mishnah Shabbat, or another word for Sabbath, Mishnah Shabbat 70b, states that grinding more than a dried fig's worth of grain constituted labor. That's about the size of your palm. Doesn't that not read like a legal document? Like something if you were going to buy a house that you'd sign? Or in a lawyer's office? Brethren, this is the kind of attitude that Jesus confronted. This is how sometimes people think about the Word of God. It sounds like language from a legal document, nitpicky, trying to fill every little loophole. And they're so focused on the bark of the tree that they forget the forest. They miss the big picture. So much so that in Matthew 23, Jesus says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint and dill and cumin, these spices, these minuscule amounts of spice, and you weigh them out on your little balance scales, and you have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness." Now, it wasn't that you shouldn't tithe these spices. That's not what Jesus is saying. But you shouldn't tithe these spices at the expense of forgetting the big things about God. These are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. This is the attitude that Jesus confronted. And this is the attitude that we must confront in our own hearts as we're laboring in the vineyard, as we're trying to follow God. And so there's the charge, there's the allegation. They were working on the Sabbath. What is Jesus going to do with it? It's awesome. He gives four arguments here in the next several verses. First of all, in verses 3 and 4, he points out the inconsistency of the Pharisees. He points out the inconsistency of the Pharisees. Let's read verses 3 and 4. By the way, before I go on, I thought I knew what this text meant, and I had an idea of what it taught. And embarrassingly, I went to study, and it's not at all what I thought it was teaching. So, and I hope to give you my convictions on this text, and I hope to make it clear to you. But I was humbled this week as I studied this. So here's the first argument. Points out their inconsistency. But he said to them, verse 3, "Have you not read what David did when he became hungry? He and his companions? How he entered the house of God, and they ate the consecrated bread," your version might say showbread, same thing, "which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those with him, but for the priests alone." And so what Jesus is doing is he's appealing to a story in the Old Testament that's found in 1 Samuel chapter 21. And it's a story of David, and David is on the run from Saul. And David finds himself very hungry, and he finds himself at a place called Nob. And he goes into the house of God at Nob, and there stands the priest Ahimelech. And David is asking for food, but there's nothing to eat. The only thing to eat in the house of God was the showbread, or the bread that was consecrated. And Jesus points out, as well as Leviticus chapter 24, that this bread was special. This bread was set apart specifically for the priests. It was meant for the priests alone. It was not meant for David. I want you to see in the text, David clearly broke God's law. He clearly broke God's law. This is what Jesus is saying. He uses the word. It was not lawful for him. Now here's what he's trying to teach the Pharisees, and he's trying to teach us. You see, the Pharisees venerated David. They held David in very high esteem. And they knew David did this. They knew the Scriptures. They had read 1 Samuel 21. It wasn't because they were ignorant of it. They venerated David, and so they excused David for breaking God's law, clear violation of God's will. But they excused it, and here they are in Matthew chapter 12, and they're condemning Jesus for doing something that was not wrong. Does that feel inconsistent? Do you see the hypocrisy in that approach? They exonerated the guilty, David, who did the wrong thing, and yet they go to Jesus and they condemn him. He's innocent. He's doing the right thing. But what Jesus here, remember when I said I learned a lot this week from this text? What Jesus is not doing is he's not appealing to a precedent where David in 1 Samuel chapter 21 did something wrong, but hey, it was okay because he was hungry. That's not what Jesus is teaching us here. No, he hasn't turned into a situational ethicist. God's law cannot be broken on the basis of extenuating circumstances. Certainly not hunger. Certainly not, maybe especially not hunger. You remember who it was last week? Matthew chapter 4? Jesus, who fasted in the wilderness for 40 days. And he was hungry, and the devil came to him, and he tempted him. Why don't you show that you're the Son of God? Why don't you prove that you're divine and use your power to serve yourself? Turn these stones into bread. And Jesus refused to do so because he knew, remember, how important it was for him to be tempted and to be tested in the wilderness? He knew if he used his powers to serve himself that he disqualified himself as our high priest. And so he refused to do that. He condemned also in Matthew chapter 5, if you turn over there, he condemned those who would break even the least of God's commandments. Remember Matthew 5 and verse 19, whoever then annuls one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. He isn't justifying his actions based upon David's example. That's not what Jesus is doing. David eating the bread that is consecrated is different than Jesus' disciples reaching over and picking a few heads of grain. One was wrong and the other was blameless. And so they're not parallel examples. So what he's doing here is he's exposing the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. Second argument is he highlights the example of the priests in the Old Testament. So now he's appealing to the law, what's written in the law. Let's read verses 5 and 6. Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and are innocent? But I say to you that something greater than the temple is here. So the prohibition against work on the Sabbath that we read in Exodus chapter 20, the prohibition against work on the Sabbath is not absolute. God makes an allowance for the priests here. The priests worked in the temple on the Sabbath. Leviticus 24 and verse 8, they changed the consecrated bread every week, the same day, on the Sabbath. Numbers chapter 28 verses 9 and 10, they made sacrifices. They made sacrifices at various points, but they especially made sacrifices on the Sabbath. You could say, in a way, the priests were working overtime on the Sabbath. They were working even more than they would normally work. And yet, Jesus calls them innocent here. He calls them blameless. And so if God, how do we reconcile this then? What's the conclusion that we should reach? If God commanded to keep the Sabbath holy by doing no work on the Sabbath, Exodus 20, while He also commanded the priests to do extra work on the Sabbath, what's the implication of that? The work of the priests superseded the Sabbath law. You see that? That's what Jesus is saying. They were innocent in what they were doing. They were following what God told them to do. And so Jesus then is making an argument from the lesser to the greater. Here's what the priests are doing. Here's what I came to do. If the temple service of the priests superseded the Sabbath law, then that means the work that I am doing, which is far greater than the priests, should also take precedence over the Sabbath. There is something greater than the temple here. You remember the temple. The Jews venerated the temple just as much as they venerated King David. They esteemed the temple. They held it in high regard. Here, the high priest would go into the most holy place and he would encounter the very presence of God that was dwelling between the cherubim and above the mercy seat. You could get no closer on earth to the glory of God. And Jesus claimed to be a greater embodiment of God's presence and God's glory than the temple. He is the exact representation of His nature. He is the full radiance of His glory. Something greater than the temple is here. Number 3, his third argument is he uses the words of the prophets here in verse 7. But if you had known what this means, And he goes on to quote Hosea chapter 6 and verse 6. I desire compassion and not a sacrifice. You would not have condemned the innocent. Jesus says, if you had known, that implies that they did not know what the prophets were teaching. They didn't know what God was saying through His prophet Hosea. If they had known the message of the prophets, then they wouldn't have condemned Jesus' disciples, who He calls innocent. And what was God saying through Hosea? God is saying, I'm more concerned with helping people with mercy than I am than honoring your man-made rules, than your sacrifices. Now, Hosea chapter 6 and verse 6, Jesus quoted that in Matthew chapter 9 in verse 13. This is the second time He's brought this passage up. And so I want you to see that this text, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, this text is not some weird, obscure passage that is hard to understand and that Jesus is just lifting out of the text to serve His own purposes. No, this text is foundational because it explains the very character of God. This is who God is. And the implications of that are profound as Jesus is talking to people who ought to know who God is. The Pharisees were actually not the master teachers that they thought they were. They were really the beginner students. And they needed to go back and learn the very basic fundamental things about God, that God is full of mercy. And His concern is for helping people and being merciful. The Pharisees, they might be content with following their own rules at the expense of having compassion on people, but not Jesus. Not Jesus. Because Jesus knew the law, and He knew the prophets, and He fulfilled the law, and He fulfilled the prophets, and the law and the prophets, in fact, testified about who Jesus is. As John 5:39, Jesus points out that the Scriptures testify about me. And after His resurrection, as He's walking on the road to Emmaus, and He finds those two guys He's talking to, and He opens their eyes to show them that it's really Him, it's the Christ, He's back from the dead. He says, He began with Moses and with all the prophets, and He explained to them the things concerning Himself in all the Scriptures. Hosea was talking about what Jesus was going to do. The law and Moses was talking about what Jesus is going to do. And the last argument that he makes is he asserts his own authority in verse 8. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, he says in verse 8. That means He is Lord, He is Master, He is above the Sabbath. Jesus is claiming to be above the Sabbath. That doesn't mean that He can arbitrarily change the rules to fit His own needs. That doesn't mean that He can violate and He can redefine the Sabbath however He wants. Jesus is the one who instituted the Sabbath. He is Lord of the Sabbath. If anyone understood Sabbath law, it was Jesus. If you wanted to know, how to follow the Sabbath law, then you would look to Jesus. And so those are His four arguments. But I want you to see here that Jesus is a genius. He is absolutely, He's a genius. The way He separates truth from error. And the way He exposes error in our hearts, as He did with the Pharisees. You see what He did? The Pharisees venerated David. But Jesus is greater than David. And Jesus was innocent, and David was guilty. The Pharisees venerated the temple, and Jesus is greater than the temple. The Pharisees venerated the prophets. Well, the prophets testified about Jesus. The Pharisees venerated the Sabbath. Well, Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. All four of these examples that Jesus draws from the Old Testament here are mere copies, are shadows of the real thing. And Jesus came to expose their true meaning. This is what Paul is saying to the Colossians. One of my favorite verses that Paul uses to explain the things of the old law. He says, things in the old law about Sabbath days and festivals and things which are a mere shadow of what is to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. This is like the old law. It's the shadow that Jesus was casting. But this is the real thing. Jesus is the substance. He's the real thing. Jesus is the king that David failed to be. Jesus is the presence, the image of God about which the temple only foretold. Jesus is the prophet of prophets, whom the prophets foretold and testified. Jesus came to give humanity the rest that the Sabbath day was teaching all along. And so what can we learn from this text as we wrap up this lesson? What can we learn from the Pharisees' misunderstanding of the Sabbath? 4 things, and I'll let you have the afternoon to dwell on these things. And again, I hope that they help you as they have me. First of all, we must be diligent to understand God's principles before we go applying them and attaching laws to them. God gave Israel the Sabbath as a gift, like He gave all of His commandments to His people. It was a gift, and it finds its roots in the 7th day of creation, as we read from Exodus 20, when God rested from His labor. Now, the outward command to do no work was clear, but the inward significance of the Sabbath was lost on these people. The Sabbath was never about abstaining from work. It was never just about having a day off. It was meant to teach Israel of a better rest to come, a spiritual rest for God's people. And the Hebrew writer explains that in Hebrews chapter 3 and 4. But the Pharisees, I want you to see in this text, the Pharisees were too busy dissecting the command and trying not to break that command that they missed the whole principle it was trying to teach. And in the process, they violated weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. Must be diligent to understand the principles God is teaching us before we go applying them. Second of all, we must be content, brethren, to speak where the Bible speaks and be silent where the Bible is silent. I realize that's not a quotation from the Bible, but I believe it's a principle that the Bible teaches. We have to be content to speak where God has revealed His will and be silent where He is silent. Let's refrain from drawing arbitrary lines in the sand that God did not draw, like the Pharisees. It's presumptuous and it's divisive in the church, and it's spiritually dangerous to introduce things into faith and into the worship of the church that God has not revealed and has not authorized. And so the Pharisees, they created these laws about the Sabbath where God hadn't created these laws. But let's not distance ourselves from them too much. We have a tendency to do the same thing. Right? God, He gives us some commands in the Bible. He gives us some commands in the New Testament. But would you agree that especially in the New Testament, that He gives us more principles? He gives us many principles about forgiveness and about mercy and about authority and these kinds of things. And He expects us to apply those principles. They have a broad application. But where God gives us a principle, sometimes we want a command, don't we? Where God gives us a principle, sometimes in our mind, what is going on is, well, okay, I understand what that's saying, but at what point does it become sinful if I do this? I know what God has said about purity and about impurity and about my mind and what I need to focus on. I know what I need to dwell on, Philippians 4 and verse 8. But at what point, should I draw the line at rated R movies? Where do I draw the line? I just want some kind of clear command. And brethren, when we do that, what we're really saying is, well, how close can I get to the line without violating God's commands? And we're showing our true colors. And we're showing where our heart is. That the kind of heart that asks, how close can I get to God's line without stepping over, is the kind of heart and the kind of person who already has their mind made up about how they want to live their life. And they're going to try and fit God's Word into their life, instead of conforming and molding themselves around the pattern of God's Word. This is why Jesus spoke in parables, by the way, to combat attitudes like this. He says in Matthew 13:13, I speak to them in parables because while seeing they do not see, while hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. To understand the true meaning of these parables in Jesus' teaching, that requires an open and an honest heart that is more concerned with glorifying God than getting away with something. And so we need to be careful about that. That we're not creating laws and we're not drawing lines in the sand just like the Pharisees. Thirdly, two more. Thirdly, the laws that we create, oddly, ironically, are more burdensome than God's laws. And it's always going to be that way. Remember the Pharisees? The more laws that they multiplied, the heavier and heavier the burden became until finally the very teachers who are espousing these laws won't even lift a finger to bear it themselves, as Jimmy read from Matthew chapter 23. The Sabbath, the law of the Sabbath was made for our blessing, for our benefit, like every command of God, to enrich us and to bring us closer to Him and to be stronger spiritually. It was a kindness, it was a gift. Man was not made for the Sabbath, Jesus says in the parallel account in Mark 2. But the Sabbath was made for man. And when we go beyond what is written, we're only enslaving ourselves to a burden that we can't bear, that we're not strong enough to bear. And lastly, the burden of Christ is easy to bear. The burden that Christ has laid on us is easy to bear. He makes a beautiful statement just in the context preceding ours, at the end of Matthew chapter 11. And it has a lot to do with what we talked about today. He says, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." And then he makes a paradox statement. "Take my yoke upon you, and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." And so what Jesus is offering all of us today, and He's offering our neighbors, is a burden that symbolizes a rest from all burdens. And so here's the image. Christ is the farmer. We are the ox. We are the animal. And it's a symbol of our willing subjection to His authority and His control. But compared to all the rules that the Pharisees and even ourselves impose upon others, compared to that burden that we throw on each other's shoulders, Jesus' burden is a kindness. It is light. It is easy. It is pleasant to bear. Now, don't get me wrong. That doesn't mean that being a Christian is easy. He's saying it's comparatively to our burdens. It is light, and it is easy, and it is pleasant. And I'll leave you with this thought, brethren, as we're coming to a close here. Those who find Christianity burdensome may be doing to the gospel what the Pharisees were doing to the law. If you find it a burden to come to this building and to worship the God of creation, then you might be doing exactly what the Pharisees were doing to the law of Moses, turning it into a legal system that requires sinless perfection to be acceptable to God. If you live your life as a Christian and it seems heavy, then I want to encourage you to understand before we break today that you're carrying a burden that belongs to someone else. And before long, you'll be crushed by it. And you're certainly, if you're burdened to come here, if you're burdened to worship God and live the Christian life, and to stand up for what's right and follow Jesus, you're certainly not under the yoke of the Lord, because His yoke is kind, His burden is light. And there may be someone here who wants to put Jesus on, who wants to be yoked, who wants Jesus to guide him and to motivate him. And He doesn't whip us. He doesn't drive us on like some sort of mindless cattle. Jesus leads us, like a good shepherd who laid down his life to protect his sheep. And if you would like to be part of his kingdom and you would like to receive that kind yoke and that easy burden, then he says, come to me, and he'll give you rest. If you're interested in that right now, we offer this time for your opportunity